There is a silence that does not follow death. It precedes it. A silence that tastes of perfume and candle wax, of silk torn slowly in the dark, of the moment just after a kiss and just before a scream. In his palace, this silence was sacred, ritual, familiar, because every night a woman whispered into a king's ear, and by dawn she was gone. Not exiled, not dismissed, gone. The sheets would still be warm, the wine half finished, the scent of her skin still lingering in the folds of the pillow, but the body, her body, would no longer belong to the world, only to the myth. He was called a king, but he was never crowned by joy. He ruled not with laws or banners, but with the intimacy of fear. And those who lived near him learned quickly, beauty was not a gift in his court, it was a sentence. Every woman who entered his chamber knew the legends, knew the warning, knew that pleasure here was barbed and sweet, like roses blooming in blood, and still some came willingly, drawn to the mystery, the promise, the danger, because he was not just a ruler, he was a story, a shadow stitched into royal velvet, and to be touched by a story, even briefly, is more than most are ever promised. They say he was handsome, not in the way of poets or portraits, but with a sharpness that cut before it ever caressed, eyes like smoke over steel, hands that never trembled, a voice that turned prayers into confessions, and a hunger, not for love, not for flesh, but for control so complete that even the night obeyed him. In public he was adored, adorned, feared. His court gleamed with gold and silence. Ministers bowed, artists painted, spies whispered, but none of them knew what happened once the doors closed, once the guards turned their eyes, once the music faded and the candles burned low. No one ever heard a scream. No one ever found a body. No one ever asked, because they knew. The palace was a mouth, and once it swallowed you, it did not chew. It erased. But he was not a monster. Not in the way we like to think of them. He loved beauty, revered it, worshipped it, and then, like all things too perfect to last, he killed it, not out of cruelty, but out of belief. To him, the divine could only be touched once. Anything more would soil it. This was his religion, a night of worship, a ritual of intimacy and annihilation. And in his mind, he was not ending lives. He was preserving moments, keeping beauty unspoiled by time, by repetition, by decay. He never used blades, never drew blood. His killings were quiet, almost tender. He'd hold her, whisper something soft. Sometimes he'd sing, and when it was over, truly over, he would remain awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, memorizing the exact angle of her fingers, the way her hair curled in sleep, the shape of the silence left behind, and by morning the room would be empty. Some believed he had a secret passage. Others thought he employed shadows, men trained to make death look like nothing at all. But the truth, like him, was more elusive. It didn't matter how, only that it happened. One night, one breath, one eternity of stillness. And he never spoke of them again, not even once. The court whispered, "Of course." Tried to guess, tried to warn, but the king listened to no one. He ruled alone, dined alone, slept never alone, but woke as if he had, as if each night were a dream that the world was not allowed to keep. And then he would choose again, not the same way twice. Sometimes a glance across a garden, sometimes a letter folded with perfume, sometimes a gift delivered with no explanation. The invitation always arrived like fate, inevitable, silent, final. And the chosen. Some cried, some begged, some came dressed in white, like brides walking toward the flame, but all of them entered. None ever returned. What kind of man does this? Not a tyrant, not a madman, a believer. Because for him, the soul was a candle, brilliant, brief, sacred, and love. Love was not meant to linger. It was meant to burn once, bright, pure, unforgettable, then vanish. And so he loved them, and so he killed them, and so he wept alone for a beauty too fragile to stay. This is the story of the king who only touched the divine once, and punished the world for letting it fade. He did not ask for company. He summoned it. Like thunder calls rain, like a flame draws moths. His chamber doors never open. They allowed entry, slowly, with ceremony, always at twilight, always as the sky surrendered its color. The servants knew what to prepare: the wine, dark, bitter, rich as secrets, the linens, white as the throat of a dove, the air, perfumed, heavy, already morning. He didn't speak much. Not at first. Words ruined things. He studied her, not like a man studies a woman, but like a monk studies a relic, searching not for pleasure, but meaning. Her wrists, her hairline, the way her breath trembled when she realized she was alone with him, truly alone, and the world had already forgotten her name. In that moment he would smile, not kindly, not cruelly, just with knowing. She would try to speak, of course, they always did. Some tried to seduce, others to plead. Some believed they could escape, others believed they could change him, that their story would end differently, that love, if offered freely, brightly, purely, could unravel the ritual. It never did, because he didn't want their hearts, he wanted their moment, and that moment had to end. He believed that the first night is always the purest, before names become cages, before memory becomes decay. The first touch is not yet scarred by expectation, the first kiss not yet stained by repetition. It is the closest thing to perfection the world allows, and he who had tasted power, war, fear, was addicted only to that. The moment before time begins to rot what it loves, so he preserved it with silence, with tenderness, with death, but not death as you know it. No blood, no screams. He did not desecrate, he honored. In his mind they were not murdered, they were exalted, like flowers picked at bloom's height, like songs ended before the final chorus while the echo still stirs the soul. Sometimes they would lie together after, their breath slowing in rhythm. He would trace their collarbone with his finger, as if drawing a map to the divine. And when sleep came, when they finally closed their eyes, he would stay awake, watching, memorizing. Then he would rise. The servants knew what to do next, though none had ever spoken of it. The body was taken, not discarded, not dumped, removed, gently. Always under the veil of the same hour, that thin sliver of night just before the world starts to forgive, and when the sun rose, the king would walk his gardens alone. He never smiled in the daylight. He never danced. His joy lived only in the dark between the first gasp and the last sigh, and by morning he was empty again, ready to begin waiting for the next spark, the next offering, the next brief eternity. People began to fear his gaze. Even the most ambitious mothers turned their daughters away. Poets stopped singing of courtly love. The palace grew quieter, its beauty sharpened into caution, and yet still some came, because some did not believe the rumors. Others did, and came anyway, because some women are drawn not to safety, but to legend. And he was a legend. He was not beautiful, but he was unforgettable. His eyes did not invite, they tested. His voice did not soothe, it bound. And when he turned his attention to you, it felt like the universe had narrowed to a single flame, and you were finally warm. But warmth in his arms always preceded the end. Not everyone loved him. His advisers feared him. His court plotted in corners, mouths wet with secrets they dared not speak aloud. Some accused him of madness, others of sorcery. There were rumors of spells, of pacts, of ghosts trapped in his halls, but none dared challenge him. Because how do you accuse a man of murder when the dead leave no trace? There were no graves, no mourning families, no accusations, only silence, the kind that grows like ivy across a wound, the kind that fills a palace with the sound of its own heart. But something changed, slowly, quietly. He began to hesitate. One night a girl arrived and smiled at him, not in fear, not in worship, but in recognition, as if she already knew who he was, as if she had been waiting. She undressed herself, not with trembling fingers, but with reverence, not because she had to, because she chose to, and he, king, predator, prophet, froze, because in her he did not see the moment. He saw the possibility of continuation, and that terrified him. He asked her name, for the first time. She whispered it like a secret. He said it back. And for a second the ritual cracked. The silence split. The room filled with something unfamiliar. The future. He didn't kill her that night. He couldn't. He sat by the window while she slept, watched the moon crawl across her face, wondered what it would mean to wake with her again, what it would cost, what it would unravel. Because if she stayed, if there was a second night, then the first would not be perfect. It would be stained, and his whole kingdom was built there on that perfection. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, she was gone. Not vanished, not taken, gone. She had walked out before dawn, unafraid, unharmed, and he was left behind, broken in a new way, because he had tasted the thing he feared most, a love that does not end, a love that returns, that changes, that demands more than silence. And now, the king who had always killed to preserve perfection had to face the truth. He had never preserved anything, only destroyed what he could not control, only buried what dared to become real. And for the first time, he wondered if he had ever loved at all. The palace had never felt this still, not in the way that follows sleep, but in the way that follows disruption, as if the very stones of the place were holding their breath. The guards at the door said nothing. The servants moved like ghosts, and the king, once a man of ritual precision, now paced, slowly, without aim. The rhythm of his power was broken, and no one could name the sound that filled its place. He had allowed her to leave, not because he was merciful, not because he was weak, but because something had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly, and he didn't know how to close it back. Her name still echoed in his mind, not loudly, not hauntingly, but intimately, like a secret only he had the right to hold, and that alone made it dangerous. Because for all of his darkness, he had never let anyone in. He had touched, yes, consumed, watched beauty flicker and extinguish, but never had he let it remain. Never had he risked letting it grow. Because growth meant unpredictability, and unpredictability, love that continues, that expands, that demands more than a single night, was something he could not contain. That was the true terror. He walked through the halls like a man staring at his own prophecy. The tapestries seemed faded now, the candlelight too soft. The throne room echoed. For the first time he noticed his own reflection, and he didn't recognize it. The face he saw was not a ruler nor a legend. It was a man, alone, aging, haunted not by his sins, but by the one soul he hadn't claimed. He tried to return to routine. He summoned a new guest. She arrived cloaked in beauty, trembling with the same mixture of awe and dread as all the others. The wine was poured, the chamber prepared, the moon obedient, but the moment, his moment, never came. Because when he looked at her, all he could see was her, the one who had walked away. He dismissed the girl before dawn, alive, untouched, unchanged. He told himself it was mercy, but deep down he knew it was confusion. His hunger, once sharp and clear, had become a question. And questions were dangerous. They loosen the hinges of conviction. They turn gods into ghosts. They make even kings tremble. The next night, he didn't summon anyone, nor the night after. Whispers grew in the court. Some said he was ill, others said cursed. His advisers tiptoed around him, afraid to speak the word aloud. Reform. Because reform meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant guilt. And guilt, in a king, was the beginning of ruin. But he was not guilty. Not yet. He was remembering. He remembered the softness in her voice, the way she didn't try to perform, didn't try to impress. She simply was. And in her being, she disrupted everything he thought was sacred. She turned the act of staying into an act of defiance. She introduced him to a form of power he had never known, the power of return. Because what is more terrifying to a man who consumes than someone who refuses to be consumed? He began to walk outside the palace walls, at night, disguised, alone, looking, not for her, he told himself, but for the feeling, the disruption. He wandered markets, temples, the river banks. He watched lovers argue, mothers cradle children, beggars sleep with open mouths. He listened, and everywhere he went he heard the same thing, life continuing. That was what she had offered him, a chance not to die in a moment, but to live in a story. And now he couldn't go back. The rituals that once brought him calm now filled him with nausea. The smell of wine made him dizzy. Silk sheets felt like shrouds. Music like mourning. He had tasted time, and time, unlike death, leaves wounds you can't explain. Still, he did not seek her directly. He couldn't. He didn't know how. Instead, he wrote pages and pages, not letters. He never intended to send them. They were confessions. To himself. To a woman who no longer needed them. To a version of himself he could barely admit had existed. He wrote of fear, of childhood, of beauty that burned too fast. He wrote of the first night he killed, how it felt not like violence, but like control, how the silence afterward had filled a space inside him that no voice had ever reached, and how now that silence mocked him. Because now he knew what he had lost. Not her. The chance to see beauty transform, to watch love bend but not break, to feel the weight of days pass not in perfection, but in persistence. And that was something death could never give him. He read old laws, old books, looked for justifications in forgotten texts, but none gave him peace. None told him how to become something other than what he had always been. Until one night, he returned to the room where it had always happened, where moments were created and destroyed, where time was bent to his will. But this time he entered not as a king. He entered as a man. He lit no candles, poured no wine. He sat on the edge of the bed, still made, still untouched, and he whispered her name, not aloud, not even to the walls, but into the hollow space where silence had once been sacred. And this time the silence answered back, not with words, with grief. Grief for every name he never said, for every body that became memory, for every woman who was more than a moment but never allowed to be more than myth. And then he wept, not like a ruler, like a man finally shattered by the weight of his own choosing. He didn't die that night, but something did. The part of him that believed love must always be perfect, that beauty must be killed before it fades, that anything that lingers must by nature be corrupted. And in its place came longing, not for more lovers, but for one beginning that didn't need an ending. He rose, he dressed, and for the first time in his reign he stepped out not to conquer, not to consume, but to ask, to kneel if he had to see if the one woman who had refused to be his story might still be his future. It had been months since the ritual ended, yet the palace still reeked of memory, the kind of memory that settles in stone and silk, not in hearts. His bed, untouched, his courtiers unnerved, the halls, once polished with certainty, now dimmed with speculation. The king had changed, and when kings change, the world around them holds its breath. He was no longer feared in the same way. Something in his presence had softened, not in kindness, but in exposure, as if the machinery of his myth had cracked open to reveal the wounded boy inside. His voice still commanded, but now it wavered when it should have thundered. He gave orders that they hurt, and then forgot them. He held court, but his gaze wandered toward doorways, toward shadows, toward the suggestion of a woman who might return, if only to remind him of what he almost had. She had left no trace, no letter, no clue. She had simply vanished back into the world, and the world, in its usual indifference, swallowed her like it swallows everything too human to be remembered by history. Still, he searched, not like a lover searches. There was no poetry in his quest. It was quiet, methodical. A king does not plead, but he waits, and waiting became his devotion. He began to visit the provinces, unannounced, a king among peasants walking roads thick with dust. He listened to old women selling herbs. He spoke with orphaned girls. He sat beside ruined wells and watched shepherds call to the wind, always hoping, always imagining he might see her, just once. Not to claim, not to kill, not even to explain, just to look at her and say, "You made me choose a world I never thought I could live in." But she remained invisible, and in her invisibility she became immortal. And that terrified him more than death, because all his life he had used death as the end, the final word, the closure that sealed every door. But she had given him no ending, only continuation. She had given him not silence, but possibility, and possibility is messier than murder. Possibility lingers. It reopens wounds long thought healed. It breathes into spaces that once knew only stillness. He tried to move on, truly. He attempted to choose another woman, not for ritual, no, for company. He invited her to dinner, spoke gently, smiled as he remembered how. She was beautiful, clever. Her laughter reminded him of storms in summer, but when she reached for his hand he recoiled, not from her, from himself, because he realized he wasn't ready to be touched by someone who didn't already know what he had done, who hadn't looked into his darkness and decided to stay, or to leave. He missed her not because she had saved him, but because she had seen him fully. And now he was left with his own eyes, and they were merciless. He began writing again. Not letters, not confessions, apologies, not to her, and he knew she would never see them, but to every woman who had ever lain beside him and vanished into myth. He wrote their names, the ones he remembered, the ones he never asked for. He conjured their faces, their voices, their trembling goodbyes, and with each name he felt his palace crack further. He visited the vault, the place no one spoke of, where their belongings were kept, a hairpin, a glove, a folded note never read, tokens, proof that they had existed, that they had not simply been erased, and for the first time he cried for them, not as trophies, not as regrets, but as women, as a people. And then he burned it all. Every token, every reminder, every relic of his hunger. The fire raged for 3 days in the lower halls. His advisors tried to stop him, afraid the blaze might consume the archives, the treasury, the legacy of a king. But he didn't care, because his legacy had already been written, in silence and fear, in sheets that smelled of finality. He wanted no trace of it left. He wanted room for something new, but power does not release its hand so easily. The court began to fracture. Some saw his grief as weakness, others saw his change as betrayal. Whispers of revolt stirred among the noble families, the ones who had once fed their daughters to his chamber as offerings to proximity. Now they felt robbed, offended, diminished, because a monster with rules is predictable. A man with a heart is not. They began to call him mad. Quietly, of course, behind doors, beneath veils. He didn't respond. Let them talk. Let them gather. Let them try. Because for the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid of being overthrown. He was afraid of being unchanged. And then a letter arrived. Folded in rough paper, no seal, no title, just a single line. What do you love now, that you would let die in peace? No name, no sender. But he knew. His hands trembled. He read it again, and again, until the ink blurred beneath his breath. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even acknowledgement. It was a mirror. And in it, he saw everything he still didn't understand. He wrote nothing back, because he finally realized this was not a story to be finished, not a love to be won, not a silence to be broken. It was a wound, a holy wound, one that he would carry not to punish himself, but to remember. He changed his laws, quietly. He outlawed secret trials. He freed servants who once guarded doors to his chamber. He paid tribute to the families of the vanished, anonymously. And each year, on the anniversary of the first night he had ever killed for beauty, he locked himself alone in the room where it had all begun. No candle, no music, just the dark. And in that dark he whispered the names, all of them, not to forget, but to ensure that someone somewhere had spoken them. Because memory, when it is honest, is not about clinging. It is about honoring what could not be undone. He ruled until his death, a quieter king, a man both feared and pitied. History never agreed on what had broken him. Some said madness, others said love, but no one denied this. The women stopped disappearing. The night no longer smelled of endings. And long after he was gone, children in the city would speak of a nameless woman who had once changed a king, not with a weapon, not with seduction, with absence. And even centuries later, her story would be whispered not as tragedy, but as prophecy. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave before you're taken. There were no statues made of him while he lived, no songs sung in the open streets. His portrait, once commissioned for every cathedral and court beyond the borders, began to fade from conversation. He had reigned, yes, but not as a man that people admired, only feared. And now that fear had softened into something else, something colder, something quieter, doubt. For decades he had governed with the authority of a myth, a king whose nights consumed beauty like flame, a monarch who did not love but consecrated, who did not court but sacrificed. And when the killing stopped, the silence left in its wake was not peace, it was suspicion. He had not confessed, not to the people, not to the court, not even to his own reflection. He had changed, but not publicly, and that absence of reckoning haunted the throne more deeply than any war ever could. The ministers began to lose confidence, not because they mourned the old ways, but because they couldn't place the man who sat before them now. His voice was slower, his temper subdued. He no longer punished those who questioned him. In fact, he welcomed their challenge. But they didn't want mercy from a man who once murdered with silence. They wanted certainty, and he could no longer give it. They spoke in closed circles, plotted as men always do when faced with the unknown. His legacy was fractured. His heirs, if they could be called that, were scattered myths, not children. He had loved no queen, crowned no consort, and every woman who had touched his bed had vanished into smoke. Now the absence of lineage loomed like a curse. He felt it too. Each morning that came without blood felt like a reminder of how much he'd forgotten, how much he had refused to see. He had not known the names of the women he killed. Not truly. He hadn't asked. He hadn't believed they mattered beyond the first glance, the first gasp, the first hour before death. And now, in the dusk of his reign, he found himself haunted by the unspoken. Not the screams. There had never been screams, only what had never been said. He began to write their names, or rather to imagine them, one by one, etching them in a book bound in gray leather, a name for every shadow that had passed through his bedchamber. He imagined where they came from, what they had dreamed of, who they had once been to someone else. He gave them voices. He gave them lives. He could never give them justice, but he could give them remembrance. And in doing so, he gave up a piece of himself each time. The book grew heavier, his body thinner. Some said it was grief, others said guilt. But no one said it aloud, because even now, after everything, they feared the man whose gaze once turned desire into doom. One night he summoned a sculptor, a woman, young, unfamous. He asked her to craft something, not of him, but of the absence. He asked her to carve what wasn't there. She looked confused, but he said nothing more. So she sculpted, and weeks later, unveiled before the court, stood a figure robed in flowing marble, face obscured, arms open, mouth closed, not in serenity, but in refusal. A monument not to a ruler, but to the ones the ruler had erased, the ones who had entered the chamber and never returned. He placed it in the center of the throne room. He made it law. Every ambassador, every official, every visiting foreigner must pass beneath her gaze before they knelt to him. Some thought it madness, others genius. But all agreed the air in the kingdom had changed. Still, one thing tormented him. She, the only one who had walked away, the woman who had not stayed long enough to be killed, not disappeared long enough to be forgotten, the one who had loved him with her absence, the one who had written, without a signature, a single question that continued to tear open his ribs from the inside. What do you love now, that you would let die in peace? He had no answer, because he still loved power, but not as he once did. He no longer loved control. He loved the possibility of not needing it. He loved the idea of beauty that could be witnessed without being possessed, of desire that could be felt without being consumed. But was that love, or just the ache of a man too tired to kill anymore? He didn't know. So he left the palace. He rode for days, alone, into the far reaches of his kingdom, places untouched by war, by court, by rule, villages where his name was a rumor, not a law. He walked the streets, bought bread from old women who didn't recognize his face, slept in barns beside strangers, and for the first time in his life he was no one. He met a child, a girl. She had his eyes, but not in the way blood reveals itself, in the way pain recognizes itself across lifetimes. She told him a story, a fable she called it, about a king who kissed women and made them vanish, about a girl who walked into his chamber and whispered a secret so powerful the king never touched anyone again. He asked her what the secret was. She leaned in close and said, she told him that the only thing stronger than death is not love, it's regret. He did not sleep that night. He stared at the stars like they owed him nothing, because they didn't. And in that moment, for the first time, he understood. He had ruled a kingdom of shadows. But she had walked into his life like a window opening in a room without air. She had breathed and left, and that breath remained, more powerful than his throne, more enduring than his myth, because she had not tried to change him. She had only asked if he was willing to change himself, and he had, not all at once, but enough that the night no longer ended in death, enough that his final years were spent naming ghosts, not making them, enough that when he died, years later, quietly, without spectacle, no one knew where to bury him. So they buried him beneath her statue, the one with the veiled face, the one with open arms, the one carved from silence. and the people forgot his name. But the story remained. They say silence forgets, but not this one. This silence spread. It lingered in stone. It sank into the bones of the palace, into the soil around the statue where he was buried. The land remembered, even when the people didn't, and that was the final irony of his life, that a man who erased others to preserve perfection was himself erased, so that others might begin again. The king had died with no heir, no queen, no bloodline to trace, no final words etched into marble. His grave bore no name, no crown, no sword, only that faceless statue above him, arms outstretched, mouth closed, body draped in stone as if protecting him, or judging him. Most walked past without knowing who lay beneath, and that was right, because his legacy did not belong to a single life. It belonged to the thousands that ended quietly, without justice, without acknowledgment, until the one woman who refused to die changed everything without lifting a blade. Her name was never recorded. Historians wrote around her, not through her. They reduced her to metaphor, to symbol. But the women who heard the stories, the girls who grew up with the cautionary fables, they knew. She was not myth. She was proof. That you can look at power and say no. That you can walk away and still remain. That love, if it is real, demands more than surrender. It demands transformation. And he did transform. Slowly, painfully, privately, like a storm turning back into sea. Some argue he never truly changed, that letting a single woman live did not undo what had come before. And they are right. Nothing undoes a life. But some things echo. In the generations that followed, rulers came and went, some just, some cruel, some forgettable. But no king was ever again allowed to hold the kind of private ritualistic power he did. No one was ever again worshipped with such blind hunger. The people remembered, even if they didn't say his name. They remembered what happens when beauty is devoured instead of respected, when women are turned into candles, burned for a single night of light. And so something shifted. Laws were passed. Voices rose. Statues were built not of kings, but of the nameless, the forgotten, the disappeared. Scholars debated the meaning of the silent woman with the outstretched arms. Some said she was justice, others grief. Some believed she was the ghost of the woman who walked away, carved to watch over him for eternity, not out of forgiveness, but out of witness. She had seen what he was, and then she had become what he never could, a story that outlived its own pain. Young girls began visiting the statue, not with flowers, but with questions. What was her name? Where did she go? Why didn't she stay? And though no one could answer, the questions themselves became the lesson. Because silence, when chosen, can be the loudest rebellion. And so in the centuries that followed, her story spread, in whispers, in songs sung by women while weaving, in poems recited by candlelight, not about romance, not about tragedy, but about choice. The king in the end became an absence, a warning, a shadow whose edges had been blurred by time, but she became a mirror. Every woman who ever stood at the edge of danger, of seduction, of destruction dressed as devotion, saw herself in her. Not because she was strong, not because she was brave, but because she left and stayed gone. She taught a kingdom that not all love is meant to be survived, that some stories are sacred only in their refusal to end in consumption, that sometimes walking away is the most terrifying, holy, irreversible thing a human being can do. She reminded them that the most dangerous man is not the one who kills, but the one who thinks killing is love, and that the most powerful woman is not the one who wins his heart, but the one who refuses to be its grave. And so the king was buried, not as a man, not as a monster, but as the memory of what happens when love is confused with possession. And above him still today she stands, not mourning, not blessing, simply watching, unmoving, undefeated,